Most people believe they stay attached to someone because of love, loyalty, or shared history. But Carl Jung understood something far more unsettling. We do not remain attached to people who harm us because they are good for us, but because they are meaningful to our unconscious. The inability to let go is rarely about the other person. It is about what they activate within us. Jung believed that when we cannot release someone, it is because a part of our psyche is still bound to them, not consciously, but symbolically. Certain people become carriers of our unresolved inner material. They hold something for us that we have not yet integrated. This is why logic fails. You may clearly see that the relationship is unhealthy, that it drains you, that it repeats the same pain. And yet, something inside you resists separation. Not because you are weak, but because the psyche does not release what it still needs to understand. Often, the person you cannot let go of represents a familiar emotional pattern. Not a new wound, but an old one. Jung observed that we are unconsciously drawn to what feels familiar, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts, because familiarity creates the illusion of safety. The psyche prefers known suffering over unknown change. This is why toxic relationships can feel strangely magnetic. They mirror early emotional experiences, dynamics learned long before adulthood, patterns of abandonment, conditional love, emotional unavailability. The person becomes a symbol, not just a partner, and symbols are not easily released. When you try to let go of such a person, it feels like losing more than a relationship. It feels like losing a part of yourself. This is because, psychologically, you are. The attachment is not only to them, but to the identity you formed around them. Who you are when you are hoping, waiting, trying to be chosen. Letting go threatens this identity. Jung believed that suffering often persists, not because it is unavoidable, but because it serves a psychological function. Pain keeps something alive. Hope. Fantasy. The possibility that this time will be different. And as long as that possibility exists, the psyche resists closure. Another reason we cannot let go is projection. We project our unlived potential onto the other person. We see in them what we have not yet become. Strength, freedom, confidence, warmth. We believe that staying connected to them keeps us connected to those qualities. Letting go feels like losing access to our own potential. But Jung insisted that whatever we project onto others belongs to us. The task is not to hold on to the person, but to reclaim what was projected. Until this happens, detachment feels impossible. And then there is the shadow, the parts of ourselves we have rejected or denied. Often, the people who hurt us activate our shadow most strongly. They trigger jealousy, dependency, anger, fear. And yet, we remain attached because the shadow seeks integration. The psyche does not want perfection. It wants wholeness, and wholeness requires facing what we would rather avoid. This is why letting go is not an act of will. It is an act of awareness. You cannot force separation from someone who still carries meaning. Meaning must be worked through, not suppressed. Only when the lesson is integrated does the attachment loosen. And this process is slow. It requires honesty about what you receive from the suffering itself. Not what you hope for, but what you actually gain. Identity, purpose, a sense of being needed. When these needs are unmet elsewhere, the psyche clings to the relationship, not because it is healthy, but because it is functional. Jung warned that what we refuse to confront in ourselves appears in our lives as compulsion. We repeat the same bonds until consciousness interrupts the pattern. And consciousness does not arrive through force. It arrives through reflection, through asking difficult questions. What am I trying to save here? What part of me is afraid of emptiness? What would remain if I truly let go? These questions destabilize the attachment. Not immediately, but gradually, because the psyche releases only when it no longer needs to hold on. Jung also understood that attachment is often mistaken for connection. But attachment is rooted in fear, while connection is rooted in presence. When you cannot let go of someone who harms you, fear is usually at work beneath the surface. Fear of abandonment, fear of being unlovable, fear of facing life without the familiar pain. The psyche asks a silent question: who will I be without this struggle? For many people, suffering has become a structure. It organizes their emotional life. It gives direction to their thoughts. Without it, there is emptiness. And emptiness feels dangerous to a psyche that has not yet learned how to rest within itself. Jung believed that the fear of emptiness is actually the fear of encountering the self. Because when distractions fall away, what remains is responsibility. Responsibility for one's inner life, for one's choices, for one's healing. Remaining attached to a harmful person postpones this responsibility. As long as the other is blamed, the self remains unexamined. This is not a moral failure. It is a psychological strategy. The psyche protects itself from moving too fast. Another reason detachment feels impossible is because the relationship provides meaning through intensity. Intensity can feel like aliveness, even when it hurts. Calm can feel empty to a nervous system accustomed to chaos. Jung observed that people often confuse emotional intensity with depth. But intensity is not depth. It is activation. Depth is quieter. It does not overwhelm. It stabilizes. For someone conditioned to turbulence, depth initially feels boring or unreal. So the psyche returns to what is dramatic, to what triggers longing, anxiety, hope, and despair. These emotions create movement. They prevent stillness. And stillness is where unresolved material surfaces. This is why letting go often brings a sudden wave of grief, not only for the person, but for the fantasy attached to them. The fantasy that one day they will change, that the suffering will be justified, that the story will finally make sense. Jung believed that fantasies are not childish illusions. They are expressions of psychic energy. They reveal what the soul desires. But when fantasy replaces reality, it traps that energy outside the self. The task is not to destroy the fantasy, but to ask what it points toward. What quality am I seeking here? What experience am I hoping to live through them? Until this question is answered honestly, release feels like loss, because something essential has not yet been claimed internally. Jung wrote that psychological growth requires the withdrawal of projections. This is one of the most painful processes a person can undergo, because it feels like disillusionment. But disillusionment is not destruction. It is the return of power. When you reclaim what you projected, you no longer need to chase it outside yourself. And only then does separation stop feeling like abandonment and begin to feel like alignment. Yet the psyche moves slowly toward this realization. It resists abrupt endings. It prefers gradual insight. This is why people often leave and return, detach and reattach, decide and then doubt. This oscillation is not failure. It is integration in progress. The psyche circles around truth until it can tolerate it. And tolerance grows through awareness, not force. As awareness deepens, the emotional charge begins to change. The person loses their symbolic weight. The bond weakens not through rejection, but through understanding. What once felt magnetic begins to feel repetitive. What once felt essential begins to feel familiar. And familiarity, when seen clearly, loses its power, not suddenly, but steadily. And this shift does not mean the relationship was meaningless. On the contrary, it means its function has been fulfilled. The psyche no longer needs that particular mirror to see itself. And when that moment approaches, letting go no longer feels like tearing something away. It feels like releasing something that has already loosened its grip. As the bond begins to loosen, many people experience an unexpected emotion: guilt. Guilt for wanting distance. Guilt for choosing themselves. Guilt for no longer being willing to endure what once felt necessary. Jung understood that guilt often arises when an old identity starts to dissolve. If suffering was part of how you defined yourself, then releasing it feels like betrayal. Betrayal of the past. Betrayal of the person you once were. Betrayal of the story that gave meaning to your endurance. The psyche resists this rupture. Asks, if I am no longer the one who stays, who am I? This question is destabilizing. So the mind searches for reasons to return. It remembers the good moments. It minimizes the harm. It reframes pain as depth. Not because the person was harmless, but because the psyche prefers coherence over truth. Jung believed that the ego seeks consistency, while the self seeks wholeness. Letting go threatens the ego's narrative. It requires admitting that something was outgrown. And outgrowing feels like loss, even when it is healthy. Another layer that complicates detachment is the role of repetition compulsion. The psyche repeats unresolved experiences in the hope of mastering them. If early love was inconsistent, distant, or conditional, the adult psyche may unconsciously recreate that dynamic, not to suffer again, but to finally resolve it. Each return carries the fantasy. This time it will be different. Jung saw this as an attempt at healing through reenactment. But reenactment does not heal. Awareness does. Until the pattern is seen clearly, the pull remains. This is why insight alone is not enough. You can understand why someone is wrong for you, and still feel unable to leave. Because the attachment is not held in thought. It is held in the body, in the nervous system, in memory. The body remembers what the mind wants to forget. This is why detachment often comes in waves. Moments of clarity followed by longing. Strength followed by doubt. The psyche recalibrates slowly. And during this process, silence becomes important. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of observation. Jung emphasized the value of turning inward, without immediately acting. Watching the urge to reach out. Noticing what precedes it. Sensing what follows it. Often, beneath the urge to reconnect, is not love, but discomfort, loneliness, restlessness, fear of emptiness. When these states are tolerated consciously, they begin to change. They soften. They lose urgency. And with this softening, the attachment weakens naturally, not through discipline, but through understanding. Another subtle shift occurs when self-trust begins to form. As long as a person doubts their inner guidance, they look outward for reassurance. Even reassurance that hurts can feel better than uncertainty. But as self-trust grows, external validation loses its grip. The question shifts from, do they want me? To, is this aligned with my inner life? This question changes everything. Because alignment does not negotiate with fantasy. It listens to sensation, to emotional resonance, to the body's response. And the body rarely lies. It tightens around what is harmful. It relaxes around what is true. Learning to listen to this language takes time, but once it is heard, it cannot be unheard. And slowly, without force, the psyche begins to reorganize. What once felt indispensable begins to feel optional. What once felt inevitable begins to feel chosen. And choice marks the beginning of psychological freedom. As psychological freedom begins to emerge, it does not arrive as relief at first. It arrives as unfamiliarity. Life without the constant emotional pull can feel strangely empty, not peaceful. Empty. Jung understood that emptiness is not a void, but a transition. It is the space left when an old structure collapses, and a new one has not yet formed. The psyche dislikes this in-between state, so it may try to recreate attachment, simply to restore sensation. This is why people sometimes miss the pain more than the person. Pain had rhythm. It had predictability. It made life feel intense. Stillness, by contrast, feels exposed. In stillness, there is nothing to blame. No drama to analyze. No emotional emergency to manage. Only oneself. This is where many people panic. They interpret emptiness as failure, rather than initiation. But Jung saw emptiness as the doorway to individuation. When projections withdraw, the energy that sustained them returns inward. This energy does not disappear. It reorganizes. But reorganization takes time. During this phase, identity loosens. Old preferences no longer satisfy. Old habits lose meaning. Old stories feel distant. This can create anxiety. The mind wants direction. The psyche asks, "Who am I becoming?" There is no immediate answer, and this uncertainty must be endured. Jung believed that meaning cannot be forced. It must emerge. Trying to fill emptiness too quickly often recreates the same patterns in a new form. This is why the psyche slows down. It invites patience. It invites listening. During this period, dreams often intensify. Symbolic images surface. Unresolved emotions seek expression. The unconscious is active, even when the outer life seems quiet. This is not stagnation. It is gestation. Something is forming beneath awareness. If the person resists the urge to rush, to replace, to numb, a new orientation begins to appear. Subtle at first. A sense of inner authority. A feeling of alignment without explanation. A quieter confidence. This confidence does not depend on being desired or needed. It rests on self-presence. Jung considered this a critical threshold. Crossing it requires tolerating solitude, without interpreting it as rejection. Solitude is not isolation. It is the condition for integration. In solitude, the psyche recalibrates. Values shift. Desires clarify. Boundaries strengthen. What once felt magnetic now feels loud. What once felt intense now feels draining. This shift does not involve judgment. It involves resonance. The nervous system learns a new baseline. And once this baseline is established, the old attachment cannot fully reassert itself. Even if contact resumes, it feels different, less consuming, less charged. The psyche has changed. It no longer needs that relationship to regulate emotion. This is why true detachment often feels anticlimactic. There is no dramatic ending, no final conversation that brings closure, just a quiet recognition that something has already ended inside, and that recognition continues to deepen, layer by layer, as the psyche adjusts to a new orientation. As this new orientation settles in, the psyche begins to revise its understanding of love itself. What once felt like love is now seen as survival. What once felt irresistible is now recognized as familiar pain. This realization does not arrive with bitterness. It arrives with clarity. And clarity is quiet. Jung believed that insight loses its power when it is accompanied by resentment. True understanding carries neutrality. The person is no longer judged as good or bad. They are simply understood as part of a psychic chapter that has reached its natural end. This neutrality is important because as long as strong emotion remains, the bond is not fully dissolved. Hatred and longing are two sides of the same attachment. Indifference, in the Jungian sense, is not coldness. It is freedom from compulsion. At this stage, memory changes. The past is no longer replayed obsessively. Moments are recalled without charge. The story loses urgency. The psyche is no longer trying to resolve something. through repetition. Instead, attention shifts inward. There is curiosity now. Curiosity about one's own patterns, about one's thresholds, about one's needs. Jung saw curiosity as a sign that consciousness is expanding. Where there was fixation, there is now inquiry. The person begins to notice how early experiences shaped their tolerance for discomfort, how love was learned through absence, inconsistency, or effort, and how those early imprints silently organized adult choices. This awareness does not demand self-blame. It invites compassion. Compassion for the younger self, who learned to equate intensity with connection. Compassion for the nervous system that adapted to instability. Through this compassion, something softens. The inner critic loses authority. Self-punishment gives way to understanding. And with understanding, the psyche stops seeking punishment through repetition. Another subtle change emerges in how boundaries are experienced. They are no longer felt as walls, but as clarity. Saying no does not feel like rejection. It feels like alignment. Distance no longer feels cruel. It feels necessary. Jung believed that boundaries are not defenses. When they arise from awareness, they are expressions of self-knowledge. As boundaries strengthen, relationships begin to reorganize naturally. Some connections fall away. Others deepen, not through effort, but through resonance. The psyche gravitates toward what supports integration, toward what allows presence, without collapse or performance. And this gravitation is not dramatic. It is almost imperceptible. Choices feel simpler. Decisions require less justification. The inner debate quiets. This quiet is not emptiness anymore. It is coherence. And coherence feels stable. Not exciting in the old way, but sustaining. The person begins to trust this stability. They no longer seek intensity to feel alive. Life itself begins to feel sufficient. This does not mean longing disappears. Longing becomes directional. It points inward, toward growth rather than rescue, toward development rather than completion. Jung believed that when longing is internalized, it becomes creativity. The energy once invested in attachment is freed. It seeks expression through work, through reflection, through authentic connection. And this movement continues, layer by layer, as the psyche adjusts to a life no longer organized around what hurts, without urgency, without force, without finality, only movement. And this is why, from a Jungian perspective, letting go is never about force. It is about consciousness. You do not release people who harm you by convincing yourself they are bad. You release them when you no longer need what they symbolized inside you, when the projection has been reclaimed, when the lesson has been integrated, when the psyche has grown large enough to hold what it once sought outside itself. At that point, attachment dissolves quietly, not because the past was erased, but because it has been understood. The relationship no longer defines you. The pain no longer organizes your inner world. The story no longer asks to be repeated. What remains is not emptiness, but space. Space for choice. Space for truth. Space for relationships that do not require self-abandonment to survive. Jung believed that psychological freedom is not the absence of bonds, but the ability to relate without compulsion, to stay without losing oneself, to leave without collapsing, to love without illusion. And when this capacity is reached, you do not ask why you could not let go before. You understand that you were not weak. You were becoming, and becoming always takes time. If this reflection resonated with you, if it helped you see your own patterns more clearly, or brought language to something you have been feeling for a long time, subscribe to this channel. Here we explore Carl Jung's ideas, depth psychology, and the inner processes that shape love, attachment, and transformation. Subscribe, and continue this journey toward awareness, integration, and a deeper relationship with yourself.